Welcome to Preservation Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. I'm your host, Luke Nichter. December is National Art and Architecture Month, and the federal government's General Services Administration is currently celebrating the 50th anniversary of its Art in Architecture program. To talk about the program and how it impacts the federal government's historic buildings, we're joined today by Jennifer Gibson, GSA's Director of the Center for Fine Arts. Jennifer, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here.
You know, we find this program at the ACHP so intriguing because I think we might be the only federal agency solely focused on historic preservation. In addition, as you might know, the ACHP was housed in the old post office building in Washington, D.C. for many years, where an artwork was placed by your program. So to kind of kick off our conversation today, first, can you tell us a little bit about GSA and its connection to historic federal buildings?
Well, as you are probably quite aware, GSA is the steward to more than 500 historic buildings across the country. And it's more than 90 million square feet of space, which houses more than 1 million federal workers. And so we have a big real estate investment in historic buildings. And our Historic Building Center, which is one of my counterparts in the Public Building Service, deals with all of the historic preservation issues and works to promote the vitality, reuse, and integrity of historic buildings. And as part of all of that, we also have artworks, many of which were commissioned at the time the buildings were constructed, and some which we're now putting into historic buildings.
Now, you're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Art and Architecture program. So how and why did this program come about in the first place?
The federal government has a long tradition of commissioning artwork for its buildings, starting with the U.S. Capitol and Constantino Bermudi's murals in the dome of the Capitol. And so we have just continued that tradition through initially the U.S. Treasury. And then when GSA was established and became the builder of federal buildings, it assumed responsibility for commissioning artworks. And in 1962, the guiding principles for federal architecture were written at the request of the Kennedy administration. And they called for commissioning the best architects of the day to design buildings that were represented the best of American design and to incorporate fine arts. In 1962, that was done largely as fine arts in federal buildings, but it was largely focused on the architects making the recommendations and incorporating artwork. And we have some wonderful work from the early 1960s. And then the program sort of languished for a bit. And in 1972, the President Nixon issued a memo directing that federal buildings should incorporate fine art. And so in 1972, the administrator of GSA issued direction that henceforth the GSA, whenever we were building a new federal building or doing a major modernization, would incorporate art by contemporary American artists. And we've continued to do so since 1972 and have commissioned over 500 works.
You know, so we're focused in our podcast, our audience is focused mainly on different issues related to historic preservation. So to sum in our audience, the connection between arts and architecture and historic preservation might not be so obvious. But I imagine you have another take. So what is the connection, would you say?
Well, it's interesting. I work closely with our Historic Preservation Office. And whenever we are going, as I said, art and architecture, whenever we build a new building, we incorporate art. So we have buildings that were constructed in the 1970s that are now are part of the historic fabric of their communities, and many are on the National Register of Historic Buildings, where our art is just part and parcel of the overall project. And there I think of the first work that we commissioned under this new phase of art and architecture that we're celebrating now, Alexander Calder's Flamingo, which is located on the plaza at the John Klaczynski Federal Building in Chicago, where you have this great ensemble of Mies van der Rohe buildings. And out on the plaza, we have the Calder. So there, it's just part of the whole historic building package, basically. We have other facilities where we have, over the years, done major modernizations. And at that point, we come in and anytime we're doing this construction, we have 0.5% of the estimated construction budget to commission new artwork. Which for every $2, it's a penny. A graphic way to think about it. If we're going into a building that already has artwork, our first use of the funds is to preserve that work. So we're going to maintain the integrity of the pieces that we already own. And then the funds that remain, we would go out to commission new work. And as we're doing all of that in historic building, we're obviously quite conscious of the limitations of what we would do to a historic building. We're not going to do anything that mars the fabric of the building, that would cause irreversible change. So that often the works, if we're in a building where, for example, we're building an annex or doing infill, the new art may go into that space. And I think of our GSA headquarters building, where the building constructed in 1917, and when there was a modernization creating links between wings of the building, we commissioned work that's in those spaces. So Jacob Hashimoto's kites, which is visible from the outside of the building, is built into the structure of the infill. And so it becomes part of the overall presence of the historic building, but there the work has not had an impact on the physical fabric of the historic building itself. We have a number of examples, and it was interesting as I started to think about art in historic buildings. Initially I thought, oh, well, there isn't that much. And I thought of the piece you had mentioned, Robert Irwin's 48 shadow planes at the old post office, where obviously it's very much part of the building. And the artist looked at the interior spaces and created an artwork that plays off against the architecture of the building, so that the hallway, the open hallways that circle the center atrium are reflected in the shadows of the shadow planes, the fabric pieces that are installed and hanging in the atrium. In other instances, like the Byron Rogers Federal Building and Courthouse in Denver, Colorado, where we have the building that was constructed in the 60s, and a number of artworks were commissioned at that time under this earlier program, including a great seal by William Joseph that's on the exterior of the building, and works inside by Robert Russin. When we did a modernization of that building in the early 2000s, which gave us the occasion to come back and commission new work. So what we're doing is an overlay or an addition to what already was there. So Jim Campbell did 2 works, both interior and exterior, in the courthouse portion. And they're actually new media works, that there are screens and images on these screens that are positioned both in the entry lobby, and then as you're on the street behind the courthouse, you'll see a series of screens and columns of light that are responding to moving figures. And then when the federal building, which is on the same plaza, was redone, we commissioned a work by Sahai Johnson, a series of porcelain pieces that are mounted, wall mounted in public areas of the building. So that you have this continuing layer. And then out on the plaza, we had a work from the original construction, Edward Britton's, there's a column out there. And we commissioned another work by Liz Larner that is also on the plaza. And it's comprised of a series of minerals and rocks and sort of gemstones from the Colorado area that are all mounted on a bronze stand, so that you have these layerings of experience over time. And I think that building is interesting because right next to it, we have one of the great historic buildings in the West, the Byron Rogers Courthouse. And there we have new Beaux-Arts murals inside by Herman Schlederman. We have on the exterior 2 New Deal sculptures. And then inside, we have additional murals that were painted under art and architecture. So you have this layering of art from many eras. So just to think about ways in which we incorporate art in historic buildings and where the art continues then to speak to people today.
You provided a number of examples there of buildings that are part of the program. And as you're describing them, I'm kind of imagining in my head what some of these must look like, having not seen a lot of them myself. And so that leads me kind of to the next question. What do you think these artworks do? What do you think the role is, the role that they play in these historic federal buildings?
It's for the public. It's another way to understand the building and our past. And often it's like when you go into museums now, everybody goes and looks at contemporary art. Contemporary art speaks to them. People think they have easier access to it because it has more familiar imagery or materials. But then often that's a way to also then open up the past because you start to see other things that are there. And as I was thinking about this, realized how we can look at buildings from the past and sometimes not understand the images. They may not be ones that are part of our day-to-day lives now, all the allegorical images on the Beaux-Arts buildings, thinking of, for example, the Alexander Hamilton Custom House in Lower Manhattan, a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. On the front, you have Daniel Chester French sculptures, the 4 continents, which are allegorical images. The top of the building has a series of realistic sculptures of seafaring nations. And you go inside, and they did something that probably now is a bit daring because it has become so much a permanent part of the building. But during the 1930s, during the New Deal, when there were all of these art programs that were intended to employ artists as workers, and to also ornament federal buildings, you have the dome ceiling of the call room with Reginald Marsh murals of the harbor, New York Harbor, that were painted under the Treasury Relief Art Project. And they now look part of the historic fabric. At the time, how startling it probably was to have these pieces of contemporary New York on the ceiling of that room, and to be depicting not an allegorical image, but scenes in the New York Harbor. And so in a similar way, as we add to buildings, we provide another means of access and engagement, and also reflect our time. And I think that's one our commitments is to commission artists who they must be American citizens or lawful permanent residents, to commission work that speaks to the public today. This layering of art over time, the Weiss Courthouse in Pittsburgh, for example, is similar. In the courtrooms, in several of the courtrooms, there are murals from the 1930s. And then when we were redoing, basically infilling that building and modernizing, commissioned artists and to do new works. And Brian Scher did 3 murals that are in the courtrooms behind the bench. So in that way, it's mirroring these 1930s courtrooms. And instead of scenes of Pittsburgh Panorama by Stuyvesant Van Veen from 1937, you have Gateway Center and the 9th Street Bridge. So they were scenes of Pittsburgh in the early 2000s as opposed to the 1930s. Plus, there's in that commissioning that we did at the time, we included a tapestry by an artist named Leah Cook that's actually images of children. And so you have this continuing wonderful dialogue over time that I hope when people walk in, they say, aha, look at that. And then they may go into another room and be open to appreciating something from the past.
Well, speaking of people walking in, do you have a sense how this artwork is received by either the public or the federal workers in the buildings themselves?
Generally, it seems to be well received. People, not surprisingly, have very strong opinions about art. So there will always be the person who say, oh, I hate it, or I don't like it, or my child could have done it, any number of things. And there are other people who marvel at both the work and that the federal government has this commitment to including art in its federal buildings and see that as a wonderful legacy for the future. And it also often can physically make differences to a space. And I'm thinking at the moment we finished a 2.5-week installation just over this past weekend of a series of murals in the Bean Federal Center, which is not a historic building to my knowledge, but it was one of those enormous military warehouse office complexes in Indianapolis, and with endless hallways and really nothing that would allow you to understand how to navigate the space. And the artists created 17 murals that have, each mural is divided up into segments so that as you walk down the hall, you sort of see the unfolding of the image. And they're all landscapes, but they're landscapes of spaces where American battles have taken place. And they are throughout our history. So there's from Concord to Fallujah. And but what you're seeing then is landscapes. The people who are in the building are marveling at how the space is changing. And they're just seeing it's that suddenly the space is coming alive. When art can do that for the people in the building, I think we have great success.
So we've talked a little bit about artwork done decades ago in historic buildings, but obviously you're still having new buildings that are joining this program, and you're still in need of artists today to create artwork, but also to restore artwork. So practically speaking, how does a building join the program? And how does a prospective artist make it known that they might be interested in helping out somehow?
I'm happy to call out artists and say, come join us. First, thinking of how we care for things. We have a commitment. Once we commission artwork, we see it as ours forever. And in time, there have been times when a building is being demolished or it's leaving the federal inventory, and we will actually remove the artwork. Or if it's a historic building, there'll be protective covenants for the artwork. But having this artwork in our collection is a commitment. And as part of that, we have an active conservation program. And we have conservators under contract so that we are always monitoring the condition of the work. We just finished the biannual inspection. So every 2 years, every installed artwork is examined to see, one, that it's still there, that it hasn't disappeared. Artwork sometimes used to disappear. And to see what sort of condition it is in. We use that inspection then to set up our priority list for conservation. So those works that we know need treatment, we will be able to plan for caring for them. We have some funds to do that, but here's where the buildings get to participate. If there's a project going on in a building, we will use a portion of the funds for that project to conserve the artwork. If there's a small project going on in a building that, even if it's just painting of a lobby and we have a mural there, as part of the scope of the project, there will be the protection of the artwork so that we're not damaging work. So we have a strong commitment for caring for our work. And indeed, as an artist is developing a proposal, we bring in conservators to look at the proposal and offer suggestions on better materials or any material concerns there might be, installation methods, how anything the artist can do to ensure that the work will last, and that will allow us to know how we're going to have to take care of it in the future. And when an artwork's being installed, we are there to document the installation so we know exactly how it's installed. And we also have a conservator come and do a baseline assessment that gives us cyclic maintenance instructions so we know how to go out and care for it and what sort of conservation actions we might have to take in the coming decades. So that's the collection that exists. The current collection or the current process is artists. We have a national artist registry, and which is available on our website and on GSA.gov. And artists can just sign up for the registry. They send us images, and when they send us images and a resume, for every project, we have a panel. And so each project, whether it's a new building or a historic building, would have its own panel that includes members from the community, the tenant agency, the design lead, as well as some arts professionals. And they make recommendations of how art might be incorporated. They suggest artists who might be considered. We do public announcements and federal procurement sites, sam.gov, and we also use our registry. So there are opportunities for artists to participate. Now, in a normal year, we might only be doing 5 new commissions because our commissions are tied to congressionally appropriated projects. So if Congress authorizes the construction or modernization of a project, we then are involved. This year, we actually, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, suddenly have all these land ports of entry, and it's 26 land ports of entry that are going to be funded. And they include a number of small historic ports. And we will be commissioning artwork for all of those. So it's suddenly our potential for numbers of commissions has expanded greatly.
Now, for someone in our audience who wants to go see some of this artwork for themselves, can you give us some basic data in terms of, are these in all 50 states, mainly cities? Do they receive members of the visiting public, or does it depend on the current use of the building? Or, what would you say?
We have artwork installed in every state except Delaware,
Hmm.
where we had a work, but we had to remove it because it was being damaged in its location. The public can look on our website and see a map. So gsa.gov/FA, as in fine art, and they can go look at a map and see where artwork is installed. We are in all sorts of places, from the middle of far on the borders. We have work in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska. We have work in large and small cities. So it really is all across the country. Getting to see it may not always be easy, in that, for example, we have work at the CIA in Virginia. I've never seen the work. They just don't let people wander in. Some of our federal headquarters buildings are more difficult than others to enter. However, we can try to make arrangements for people to enter the buildings. And in the National Capital Region, Washington, D.C., we have a group. Our fine arts officers give tours of some of the buildings, so people can do that. Federal courthouses are open to the public, so anyone is able to walk into a federal courthouse. Federal buildings, you may have to be met. So we welcome inquiries about how to get into the buildings. The artwork that we commission is always in a public area of the building. So we're not putting artwork in conference rooms or offices. Our goal is to have it in an area where anybody who's able to enter the building would be able to see it. So it's generally in lobbies, sometimes elevator lobby areas, on the outside exterior of the building, or out on plazas in front of it. But this is work that's intended for the public, not just for the person who's working in the building.
Well, final question, and then you've passed the test with us here today. And you've alluded to this already, but just to wrap it up for our audience, where can they learn more? Where can they go to find out more about the program, get in touch, get involved, and really just learn more?
I encourage people to go to gsa.gov and type in fine arts or art and architecture, and it will lead you to our website, which we're actually going to be refurbishing our website this coming year. But for the moment, you'll be able to find a lot of information on the pages about art and architecture. You can learn more about how to participate in the program, and our policies are there as well. If you're a policy person and want to read policies, they're there. And we have a fine arts page that also talks about the ownership of federal artwork, because we have a very active program with our Inspector General in recovering artwork from the New Deal. And it also, on the locations map, people can see all of the museums and institutions where we have artwork on loan. And those are works primarily from the 1930s.
Well, it's just a super overview of this interesting program that I was not familiar with, and I hope will spread word of it and the really interesting work that you're doing. And so I just want to close by saying, thank you so much, Jennifer Gibson, for being our guest today.
Thank you very much, Luke. It was a pleasure.
Be sure to follow the ACHP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation news. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.